Good afternoon, children.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Meeting now. Yes. How was your Onam? Went well? Enjoyed?
Yes, ma'am.
Didn't feel like joining back for the classes?
No, ma'am.
No. Oh, you were so curious to join the classes again. Okay, I had asked you to revise whatever topics we had completed, or what I asked you to revise? Life processes, no?
Nutrition in human beings.
Okay. Anyways, let's begin with the pollination process. Already I had explained what is meant by pollination and self-pollination, but you might have forgotten. Everything might have gone under the holiday. So I'll repeat pollination again. Anybody is remembering what is pollination? Can anybody recollect? Yes? Yes, Rizan.
Ma'am, it will move to the some
It
other
will move to
plant.
where? What will move? To where it will move?
Same and petals to another.
Yes, Shania.
Transfer
Ma'am.
pollen grains
Transfer
from
of
Pollen grains.
grains from an
From?
anther of a flower to stigma of another.
From anther to the stigma. So pollination in general, we can say it is a transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Anther is the male part, stigma is the female part. Stigma as such, it is not the female part. Carpel is the female part and stigma is a part of this carpel. Okay. Carpel has got three parts: stigma, style and ovary. Similarly, stamen is the male part. It has got anther and filament. So pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. You remember PAS, P-A-S, PAS. P for pollen grains, A for anther, S for stigma. Pollination. PAS. Remember the term PAS, PAS. P for pollen grains. Pollen grains are transferred from A to S and the to stigma. Then you will not forget. Okay. Once again, I will repeat. Pollination is a transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. And now let's learn about the two types of pollination. Already self-pollination we had covered, but I'll repeat it again. Self-pollination means transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. Here, two plants are not involved. Single plant, either from the same flower, anther of the same flower to the stigma of the same flower, or the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower belonging to the same plant. Two plants are not involved. But when the transfer is taking place between two different plants, related species, two different plants, then you can call it as cross-pollination. Two different rose plants or two different jasmine plants or any two different flowering plants, then you can say it is cross-pollination. But if it is taking place within the same plant, from the anther of a flower to the stigma of same flower or another flower belonging to the same plant, then it is self-pollination. But if it is transferring from one plant, flower of one plant to another plant or another flower of a different plant, then it is cross-pollination. I'll show you the slide. Pollen grains need to be transferred to the stigma for fertilization to take place. And pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. And I told you to remember PAS. S for stigma, A for anther, P for pollen grains. So pollination. Pollination, you can memorize using the mnemonic pass. Transfer of pollen grains. Pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma. That is known as pollination. And there are two types of pollination, self and cross pollination. And self pollination means the pollen grains are transferred from anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. Once again, from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower, anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower belonging to the same plant. Here only same plant is involved in self-pollination. Okay, once again, transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower, but of the same plant. Then it is self-pollination. Okay? Whereas cross-pollination, see, these A and B,
Ma'am,
yes,
self-pollination can show that.
I will.
transfer of-
A and B both are self-pollination. Whereas when the pollen grains are transferred from one flower to another flower, but these are same species, not entirely different plants, then you can call it as cross-pollination. Here two plants are involved in cross-pollination, whereas in self-pollination, only one plant is involved. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower, to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same kind. It should be of the same kind. From hibiscus, the pollen grains, or from rose flower, it cannot fall on jasmine and bring about pollination. It should be same kind. Only then it can happen. Only then pollination can happen. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower of a different plant. Another flower of a different plant of the same kind is known as cross-pollination. And somebody wanted to see self-pollination again. Transfer of pollen grains. Children, whether it is self-pollination, cross-pollination, till here this is same. Till here it is same. I'll just underline. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma. Up to here it is same. This much is same for self and cross-pollination. Here the changes. Now remaining what has been written, their changes are there. So whether it is self or cross-pollination, you can begin by saying like this: transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma. And the difference is in the next part. And if it is self-pollination, you have to say stigma of same flower or another flower of the same plant. Okay? And in cross-pollination, it is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma. I told up to here it is same. It's common for self and cross-pollination of another flower of a different plant of the same kind, that is cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is better from the perspective of variations. Why? Because in self-pollination, the chances of variations are less because same plant is involved. But when, just like in sexual reproduction, two parents are involved, it is both cases, whether it is self and cross-pollination, both are examples for sexual reproduction. But when it is limited to, yes.
Ma'am, in the self-pollination,
Let me repeat. After that, I'll repeat everything. Okay. When it is self-pollination, only one plant is involved. So chances of variations will be less. And when two plants are involved, as in cross-pollination, the chances of variations will be more. and there are different agents to bring about pollination, especially cross pollination. Insects, animals, air, water, all these can lead to the transmission of pollen grains from one flower to the stigma of another flower. So different agents of pollination: insects, animals, air, water, etc. Fizan, what was your doubt?
Ma'am, and the self-pollination that will go to same plant, then
Same plant.
cross-pollination.
Different plants of the same kind.
Uh,
Same kind of plants, but two different plants are involved. Very clear from the picture given here. See, A and B, it is limited to the same plant. Whereas in C, from one plant, the pollen grains are transferred to another plant. But seeing the picture, you can understand both plants are of the same kind. Okay. So, hope you have learned what is self-pollination, cross-pollination, and agents of pollination. Yes? Can I change?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. Before we proceed to fertilization, I just want to know whether you have understood pollination. What is pollination, Ahalam?
Ma'am,
Wait,
agent of cross-pollination, can you show?
I will show. Yes, Ahalam. And those whose videos are off and those who have not left me a message, you can leave the session, children. Why to waste your time? Some of you have messaged me that your connectivity is poor. It's okay. Okay, Lena. Yes, Ahalam. Tell me what is pollination?
Transfer of pollen grains from anther
To?
to stigma.
I told you to remember pass. Pollen grains from anther to stigma. Okay, Sania, tell me what is self-pollination?
The transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a plant to the
Anther of a? Anther of a?
flower,
Ah,
flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant.
same plant. Very good. Once you have understood, once you have learned the meaning, understood the meaning, then you try to learn, it will be easy for you. But don't simply by heart. Anuj, beautiful wall. Only that I can see. So that I have to appreciate, no? Anuj, now give me the answer. What is cross pollination?
Transfer of pollen grains of anther to stigma of a
Stigma of
another flower of the same kind of plant.
Once again, you concentrate. I'll make your friend repeat it. Sean, listen, Anuj. After that, you should repeat. Yes, Sean.
Pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same kind.
Yes. Different. Last part, I had some confusion, Sean.
Same kind. Of the
Same kind. Okay, okay. Anuj, I'll repeat it again. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Sorry, anther to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same kind. Got it, Anuj? Transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same kind. Can you repeat? Anuj?
Ma'am,
Yes.
transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower to the stigma of other flower of a different plant of the same kind.
Very good. Once you understand the meaning, it will be easy to memorize. Okay. So that was about cross pollination. Which is better? Which type of pollination is better to promote variations? Isha, which is better to promote variations? Self or cross pollination?
Ma'am, cross pollination.
Cross pollination. Name some agents of pollination, Rachel. Some agents of pollination. Rachel, George.
Ma'am, insects, animal, air, water.
Insects?
Animals, air and water,
Ah,
etc.
insects, other animals, air, water, etc. So shall we continue with fertilization?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Now, pollination has taken place. Pollination will be followed by fertilization. You know that fertilization means fusion of
Gametes.
male and female
Male and
gametes.
female gametes.
And in a flower, where is the male gamete? Where is the male
Stamen.
gamete? Huh?
Stamen.
Inside?
And stamen.
Louder.
Stamen.
And
Specify. Inside the stamen, where it is?
stamen. Then, on the top of that.
Just now we were discussing about that only, no?
Right.
Ah,
And
Anther.
one at a time. Who can tell me? Chitan, you know the answer?
Anther.
Yes?
And
Pollen grain. It is inside the pollen grain that the male gametes are present. Each pollen grain has got 2 male gametes. And where is the female gamete present? It is inside the ovary. Now the pollen grains, by means of pollination, where the pollen grains will reach? Gauri, where the pollen grains is reached as a result of pollination?
the plant, to the plant.
Gauri,
Stigma.
stigma. It has reached the stigma. And you know that stigma will be continued as style, then only ovary comes. So from there, the pollen grain should reach the ovary and the egg, the female gamete. Already you told me that male gamete is present inside the pollen grain. Now, pollen grain has fallen on the stigma. From the stigma, these pollen grains or the gametes present inside the pollen grain should reach the ovary, because inside the ovary we have egg or the female gamete. So let's learn more about fertilization. Fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. Once they fuse, what will be formed? Zygote. Fusion of male and female gametes resulting in the formation of a zygote, or else you can say it is the fusion of male and female gametes to form a zygote. That is fertilization. This you had been learning from lower classes. And what happens once a zygote is formed? Children, how many cells are there in a zygote? How many cells?
2.
Then, any other option? 8th standard, you had learned it. 2. All are saying 2. Any other answer? Srihari, why did you say 2?
Ma'am, male gamete and female gamete, they are different cell.
But what is the process of fertilization? Fusion. So will it remain as 2 different cells or a single cell? Single cell. That is why we say they are fusing. Upon fusing, 2 different cells will become 1. So zygote is a single cell structure. It is unicellular. In class 8, you have learned differences between zygote and embryo. Zygote is unicellular, embryo is multicellular. Once zygote is formed, it will undergo repeated division. It will divide and forms multicellular embryo. This embryo will be present inside the ovule. Where is ovule? Inside the ovary. Inside ovary, inside ovary, ovule, inside ovule, embryo will be formed. Okay. Once again, fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes to form a zygote. Zygote will undergo repeated division and forms an embryo. And this embryo is formed inside the ovule. Later, From this embryo, a new individual will be formed. A new organism will be formed from this embryo. Once again, I will show you the points. Fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. Once they fuse, a zygote will be formed. Zygote is single cell. It will divide and form a multicellular embryo. From this embryo, a new individual will be formed. Or else I will just simplify it for you. Just a minute. Male gamete, female gamete. Male gamete, female gamete. These two will fuse. They will form a zygote. Zygote is single cell, and this zygote will develop into embryo, and embryo will form a new individual. Okay. Male and female gametes fuse, they form a zygote. Zygote has got only one cell. From the zygote, embryo will be formed. From embryo, a new individual will be formed. Okay, the same thing I had explained earlier also. So I showed it in the form of a flow chart so that you can easily understand. Don't worry about the figure given there. Just to enhance, just to improve your level of understanding, I've included that. That is not there for you to learn. Okay. Now, first we are going to learn the fertilization process taking place in flowering plants. Very important. Children, in your textbook, fertilization process is not given in detail. But here I have added some more points so that you can understand the concept better, because in higher classes also you have to learn about this. In 11th also you are going to learn about the detailed process. So some points which are not in the textbook I have included so that you can understand the concept better. Okay, so please listen carefully. You may not get it from the textbook, all the points which I'm going to say. So listen carefully. Any doubts you can ask me. Shall I begin? And some of the points I'm repeating again. Some of the points which I'm going to say you may not find in the textbook. So it is very...
Can you fertilization once more?
Yes?
Fertilization, that slide can you
okay,
show?
okay, I'll repeat it again. Fusion of male and female gametes resulting in the formation of a zygote is known as fertilization. You had been learning this from 8th standard. Male, female gamete fuses and form a zygote that is known as...
Ma'am, what is the spelling of fertilization? Is it S or Z?
Both can be used. Both are correct. You can either use it as Z or SS. Many words are like that. Realize, fertilizer, fertilization. Both are correct. Both spellings you can use. Either Z or S. Okay. Zygote is formed, and once zygote has formed, it will change into embryo, and from the embryo, a new individual will be formed. After the pollen grain lands on a suitable stigma, it will germinate and forms a pollen tube. Children, you know that it is inside the pollen grain that our male gametes are there. So if fertilization has to take place, it should fuse with the egg. And what happens is, once the pollen grain, as you can see in the figure over here, see, pollen grains will fall on the stigma, and it is inside these pollen grains that male gametes are there, and our egg is there down here. Egg cell is present here. Okay, egg cell is over here. For that, it has to come down. How it will come down? The pollen grain, after landing on the stigma, it will germinate. Upon germination, it will produce a tube, which you call as pollen tube. Say, for example, if this is the stigma, okay, and this is the ovary, and it is inside the ovary, the egg is present. So, once the pollen has landed over here, it will germinate and they will produce a tube. And this tube will grow towards the egg. And once the pollen tube reaches there, it will transfer the male gametes, which will result in the fusion of male and female gametes. Okay, once again, I will repeat. After the pollen grain lands on the stigma, that process you already learned, pollination. Pollen grain landing on the stigma is pollination. Once pollination has taken place, the pollen grains will germinate. And once the pollen grains germinate, what it will produce, Isha? Isha? Pollen grain upon germination will produce?
Pollen tube.
You're feeling sleepy? Slightly,
Uh,
no? Or you're getting bored? Slightly distracted, that's what I feel.
my mother is here. That's it.
Mother is distracting you. Okay, now next point. The pollen tube grows through the tissues of stigma and style and reaches the ovule. Children, you know that egg is present inside the ovule. Egg is present inside the ovule. But the pollen grains have landed on the stigma. From the stigma, it has to move through the style and reach the ovule. Only then the male gametes can fuse with the egg. The embryo sac is present inside the ovule. Children, I have shown here the third picture. See the third figure. Third figure. Here you can see the picture of an embryo sac. And it is inside the embryo sac that the egg is present, or the female gamete is present inside the embryo sac. Here you can see 3 cells. Here also you can see 3 cells. In the center you can see another cell. Okay, another structure, you call it as polar nuclei. And these two on either side, these two you call as synergids, and the egg cell is only one. There is just one egg cell which is in the center of synergids. And here you can see 3 cells, you call it antipodals. Once again, I know you are getting confused. I'll repeat it again. Where is the egg present, children? Where is the egg present? Inside? In flowers. Where is the egg cell or the female gamete present?
Inside ovule.
Inside ovule. Where is ovule?
Inside ovule.
Ovary. Okay. Ovary is a part of carpel. Carpel has got 3 parts: stigma, style, ovary. Inside ovary, ovule. Inside ovule, egg is present. Inside ovule, actually, there is an embryo sac. In this embryo sac, you can see so many cells over there. But this alone is the egg cell. This is the egg. These 2 are synergids. These 3 are antipodals. Then there are 2 polar nuclei. So many other structures are there. But the female gamete is only this one. That is a female gamete. And where is it present? It is present inside the embryo sac, located inside the ovule. Now, once the pollen grains fall on the stigma, it should germinate and form a pollen tube. And through the pollen tube, what will be transferred, children? Through the pollen tube, what gets transferred? Why the pollen tube is formed? Let it be wrong, you respond.
To transfer the male gamete to
Male gametes. The pollen grain is having 2 male gametes. If it remains on the top, on the stigma itself, it cannot fuse with the egg. it has to make a bridge and reach the egg cell, which is there inside the ovule. So once the pollen falls on the stigma, it will germinate, forms a pollen tube, and through the pollen tube, the two male gametes will move and reach the ovule. So the embryo sac present inside the ovule has got several cells, 3 antipodals, 2 polar nuclei, 2 synergids, and just 1 egg cell. This alone is the female gamete. All others are having different function. Female gamete is only this one. So once again, there are 3 antipodals. In higher classes, you will learn more about it. You can see so many cells. Egg cell is just one. Other than that, you can see 2 synergids, 2 polar nuclei, and 3 antipodals. All these are present inside the embryo sac, present inside the ovule. Now, what happens to the male gamete? The male gamete, you know, 2 are there. One will definitely fuse with the egg cell to form a zygote. And what are the functions of all the other cells that we listed? How do they take part in fertilization process? 2 polar nuclei present in the center. This one. These 2 nuclei present in the center, they will fuse and they will form a structure known as secondary nucleus, diploid secondary nucleus. They will form a diploid secondary nucleus. All these are not mentioned in your textbook. You can write in your lecture note. Only then you will understand it better. They form a diploid secondary nucleus. And children, if you're not following also, not to worry. I will repeat it again in the next class. Okay, no need to worry whether you have thinking that, oh, I did not understand what she explained. Not to worry. I'll just quickly summarize what we learned just now. I told fertilization is the process of fusion of male gamete with the female gamete. And once they fuse, what is formed, Adulya?
Zygote.
Zygote. Zygote will develop into?
Embryo.
Embryo. Once the pollen grain has landed on the stigma, what will happen next, Elsa? After the landing of pollen grain, pollen will? Pollen will fuse. Pollen grains has fallen on stigma. Geraldine, what is next?
It will germinate.
It will germinate. Elsa, upon germination, what do they produce? I'm not going to leave you. After germination, what do they produce? Pollen grains germinate and form? Pollen tube, correct. Pollen tube. And pollen tube is meant for carrying, what for? Who can tell me? Why are these pollen tubes formed? To carry
Male gametes.
male gametes to
Female gametes.
Okay. And where is the egg cell of female gamete present? Inside? Which sac? Which sac?
Embryo sac.
Embryo sac. Where is embryo sac? Inside? Ovule. Where is ovule? Inside ovary. Inside embryo sac, what are present? What are the different cells present? Who can memorize? Swati, what are the different cells present inside embryo sac?
3 antipodals.
3 antipodals.
2 polar nuclei.
2 polar nuclei.
2 synergids.
2 synergids. That is said, I think. One egg cell. Very good. So those who haven't understood, not to worry. Next class, I will again repeat this. Okay. So we'll wind up. Thank you, children. See you next class.
Thank you.